Why did he stop at that shelf when every other man would have hurried on? The fluorescent lights of the base exchange hummed above, a faint mechanical buzz that blended with the clatter of carts and the low murmur of conversation. The shelves stood in rigid rows, lined with the daily essentials of life on a Navy base: canned goods, powdered drinks, boxes of cereal stacked like tiny towers. For most who passed through, this place was a forgettable stop. In and out, a routine errand, nothing more. But Silas Cain moved differently. The old man stood still, his weathered hands turning a can of soup carefully, as though reading its label required all the patience of a craftsman inspecting a tool. His jacket hung loose on his shoulders, jeans faded from time, and on his head sat a cap, navy blue, the fabric nearly threadbare, the embroidered anchor softened by age. Some men wore such caps for vanity, to signal a service long past. But with Silas it was different. The way he touched the brim, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, this was not nostalgia, it was weight. And that weight, unspoken but undeniable, irritated Lieutenant Commander Price more than he could admit. "Is there a problem here, old man?" The voice cracked the air like a whip, loud, sharp, steeped in a confidence that hadn't been tested beyond the walls of a classroom or a polished conference table. Price stood tall, hands braced on his hips, his chest puffed like a man eager to show the world how far his uniform could carry him. His ribbons caught the light. His boots shined. Every piece of him was regulation perfect. But authority is not measured in fabric or shine, and Silas Cain's silence made that painfully clear. He looked up, slow, deliberate. His eyes, clearer than they had any right to be at his age, met Price's glare. Not defiant, not pleading, just steady, observant. That stillness, that calmness, was like sand in the gears of Price's authority. It unsettled him in a way anger never could. "I asked you a question," Price pressed, his tone sharp enough to turn heads in the next aisle. "You're holding up the entire row. People have places to be. This isn't a library." A few shoppers slowed, their carts drifting to the side, pretending to study the shelves while their ears strained for more. Conflict, after all, is magnetic. Silas set the can back down on the shelf with a soft click. He adjusted the brim of his cap, straightened slightly, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried like gravel rolling in a low river. "My apologies, Commander. I was just deciding." It wasn't the words that cut, it was the tone. Weathered, patient, steady. A man who had lived long enough to know which arguments were worth fighting and which were not. For Price, that calm was like a challenge, his jaw clenched. He had seen this kind of posture before, men who refused to be cowed. But those men had stripes on their sleeves, bars on their collars. This one was nothing, a relic, a civilian wrapped in the rags of an old service. He would not let this stand. "It's a can of soup," Price snapped, stepping closer. "Not a career choice. Some of us have actual duties to attend to. What's your business here anyway? This exchange is for active duty personnel and their dependents, not for ancient mariners to clog up the works." The barb found its mark not in Silas but in the crowd. A young sailor shifted uncomfortably. A spouse frowned and pulled her child a little closer. Respect for the uniform faltered in that moment. Silas only adjusted the cap again, his fingers brushing the frayed edge. "I have an ID card, Commander. I'm permitted to be here." That calmness again like a wall, no anger, no fear. Price felt it pressing against him, and he mistook that resistance for disrespect. His face flushed. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on his back, waiting to see how he would enforce authority. "An ID card, let me see it." His hand snapped out, imperious, demanding. For a moment Silas did not move. He simply breathed, slow, steady, before pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. His hands trembled slightly with the stiffness of age, but the card he drew out was clean, standard issue, government stamped. He held it out gently. Price snatched it with the hunger of a man desperate to find fault. He scanned it, eyes darting for an expiration date, a flaw, any reason to strike. He found none. The card was valid, more than valid. He tossed it back with a sneer. Fine, it's valid. That just means you're technically allowed here. Doesn't mean you own the place. Frankly, I'm tired of seeing your type living in the past pretending your little service mattered. What did you even do, old man? Push papers, peel potatoes. You wear that hat like you won a war yourself. The words were venom. But Silas's expression didn't change. Only his eyes shifted, a deep weariness passing through them like a cloud drifting across still water. He had heard this before. He had seen young men mistake rank for wisdom, mistake shouting for command. He turned, sliding the wallet back into his pocket, ready to leave the soup behind. But Price wasn't finished. He stepped into Silas's path, blocking him. I'm not done. You're a loiterer. I'm ordering you to leave the exchange now, and don't let me see you here again. The shoppers froze. The atmosphere had shifted, no longer just an awkward exchange but a spectacle. Something had crossed a line. From the end of the aisle, a broad figure began to move. Master Chief Petty Officer Davies. Stocky, weathered, 25 years of service etched into every step. He didn't rush, didn't bark. He simply walked, a steady presence radiating calm authority. "Commander Price, sir," Davies said, his voice respectful but carrying a firmness that could not be ignored. "Is there a problem I can help with?" Price turned, irritation flaring. "It's handled, Master Chief. This man was causing a disturbance. I've ordered him to leave." Davies' eyes flicked to Silas. He saw not a troublemaker, not a vagrant, but an old sailor standing with quiet dignity. A man whose stillness spoke louder than any defense could. "With all due respect, sir," Davies said carefully, "he doesn't appear to be causing a disturbance. Perhaps we can de-escalate." It was gentle, reasonable, but to Price it was a challenge. His authority undercut in front of witnesses. "Are you questioning my order, Master Chief? I am the senior officer here. This man is leaving. End of discussion." The tension thickened, air stretched taut as wire. And then the aisle shifted. Conversations hushed, carts stilled. A presence entered, invisible at first, then unmistakable. Admiral Thompson. Tall, graying temples, eyes sharp enough to strip a man of excuses with a glance. His aide trailed 2 paces behind, his own expression tense. Price stiffened instantly, his salute snapping up with near panic. "Admiral, sir. Good afternoon, sir." But the Admiral's eyes slid past him without pause, falling instead on the old man in the cap. His gaze lingered, studying the lines of the face, the bearing, the quiet stillness. There was something familiar. He stopped directly before Silas, ignoring the younger officer entirely. "I apologize for my officer's behavior," the Admiral said, his voice even, respectful. "It is not the standard we uphold here." Price's stomach plummeted. The Admiral wasn't speaking to him. He wasn't even acknowledging him. The Admiral continued, his tone gentler now. "My name is Admiral Thompson. May I ask your name, and what unit you served with?" Silas looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing the cost of honesty. Then, quietly, "Cain, sir, Silas Cain. I was with the underwater demolition teams, back before they were called SEALs." The words landed like stones in a pond. Master Chief Davies froze, his eyes widening. The UDTs, the legends, the ones whispered about in training halls. Price felt nausea rising. He had mocked this man. This wasn't a paper pusher. This wasn't a pretender. The Admiral nodded slowly, something flickering in his expression. Recognition, disbelief, reverence. And then he asked the question that would strip the last veil away. "Mr. Cain, did you have a call sign?" Silas hesitated. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with the shadow of something long buried. And then, with quiet resolve, he spoke. "They called me Ghost 5. The words detonated in the silence. The Admiral's face went pale. His jaw slackened. A hand trembled against his side. He stepped back as though struck, eyes locked on the old man not with pity but with awe-terror even. Around them sailors stood straighter, aides gasped, even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. Ghost 5. A name most had only heard in whispered stories, campfire legends at Bud S, told to inspire trainees. A ghost story meant to teach endurance, courage, sacrifice. And here he was, alive, standing in the soup aisle. Price's chest constricted. He swallowed against the shame burning his throat. The Admiral whispered it, voice raw, "Ghost 5." And in that moment the commissary was no longer just a store. It was a cathedral. What did the Admiral see in those words that made his face turn white? The silence in the commissary stretched, heavy and suffocating. Every sailor, every spouse, every child who had paused mid-step now stood motionless, caught in a moment that seemed to slip outside of time. The name hung in the air, echoing louder than a shout. Ghost 5. Lieutenant Commander Price didn't understand. He only knew enough to feel fear, because the Admiral, a man who carried the weight of entire fleets on his shoulders, looked at Silas Cain as though staring at a ghost. Admiral Thompson's lips parted, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual authority. "Ghost 5," he repeated, like a prayer half-whispered in the dark. He took a step back, the weight of recognition settling in his chest. Memories came, unbidden, of classrooms at the academy where instructors spoke in hushed tones, of old stories carried forward without names. Stories of survival so impossible they bordered on myth. A lone man behind enemy lines. 23 days hunted, surrounded, yet unbroken. A man who carried his mission through when every comrade had fallen. And in those stories there was always one line at the end. He never made it home. Yet here he stood. The aide beside the Admiral audibly gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. Master Chief Davies, a man not easily rattled by anything, stared at Silas with eyes wide and misted, as though he were watching a living page torn from scripture. But for Silas Cain, the moment carried no triumph, only burden. He adjusted the brim of his cap, not meeting the Admiral's gaze, his face calm but tired. It was the look of a man who had carried a name for too long in silence. Admiral Thompson straightened, forcing steadiness back into his bearing. He turned his head slowly toward Price. The change was terrifying. Where moments ago his face had shown awe, now it burned with a silent fury. "Commander," he said softly, every word laced with ice, "do you even comprehend what you've just done?" Price's throat went dry. He tried to swallow, but his mouth betrayed him. "Sir, I don't." "You don't know," the Admiral cut him off, his tone low, deadly calm. "That much is obvious. Let me educate you." He turned, his eyes returning to Silas, then to the crowd. His words carried weight now, the cadence of history itself being laid bare. Ghost Team, Winter 1968, a 5-man element hand-picked, commissioned for a mission so deep in the shadows that even most of the Joint Chiefs weren't read in. Operation Nightfall. A ripple of unease spread through the onlookers. The name meant nothing to most, but the tone in the Admiral's voice made it feel like sacred ground. They were sent to Halo Jump behind the Iron Curtain. Their target, a Soviet submarine guidance system, new technology. If deployed, it could have shifted the balance of the Cold War overnight. The mission was critical, but their insertion was compromised. Waiting for them was an entire Spetsnaz division. The Admiral paused, his chest rising as though steadying against the memory of stories he had only ever heard whispered. 4 men died almost immediately. 1 survived, alone. 23 days he evaded them in terrain as hostile as any battlefield in history, hunted by trackers, dogs, helicopters. Yet he did not run. He carried the mission forward. Every sailor in the aisle stood rigid now, their spines straightening instinctively, as if standing inspection before an invisible muster. Alone, he found the target, he destroyed it, and with no exfiltration, no support, no hope, he walked 200 miles through frozen wilderness across hostile territory until he reached the Turkish border. 23 days, no backup, no witnesses, and when he crossed, he disappeared. The admiral's voice broke just slightly. His name was written down as KIA, his file sealed under the highest classification, his story told to inspire young men to push past their limits, but always as a legend, always as a ghost story. He turned back, his eyes meeting Silas's. "We were told he died there, a hero. We had no idea he lived, no idea he walked away." The words landed with a reverence that felt almost like confession. Price stood frozen. His world had tilted violently. He saw not a frail old man, but something beyond comprehension, a monument wrapped in flesh and bone. Shame coiled tight in his chest, burning. Every insult, every sneer, every dismissal he had hurled felt now like he had spat at the flag itself. The admiral's fury returned to him, sharper now. "Commander Price, you mocked him. You humiliated him. You dared question his place here in front of those who wear the uniform he bled for. You." "Sorry." The interruption came not from an officer, not from the Master Chief, but from Silas himself. His voice was quiet, measured, cutting through the air with the same calm he had carried since the first word. "He's just a boy, Admiral." The admiral stopped mid-breath, his jaw tense. Silas looked at Price, and in his eyes there was no anger, no vengeance, only a profound weariness, and something deeper still, pity. "Full of vinegar, more pride than sense," Silas continued softly. "He'll learn, they always do." The admiral's chest heaved once, as though swallowing a retort, but he bowed his head ever so slightly, a gesture of respect to a man who had earned the right to say such words. Master Chief Davies stepped forward then, his posture straight, his voice unsteady with the emotion he was trying to suppress. "Sir, if you'll allow me, I'll escort Mr. Cain to your office." Admiral Thompson nodded. "See that he's given coffee, a seat, and anything else he requires. He is our guest of honor." Davies turned to Silas, but he did not take his arm or guide him. He simply inclined his head. "If you'll follow me, sir." The old man nodded. He adjusted his cap once more, then began to walk slowly down the aisle, past the rows of frozen faces, past the sailors standing at rigid attention, past the young commander whose world had crumbled in a single breath. And as he passed, the silence followed him, broken only by the faint hum of refrigeration units, the sound now like the echo of history itself. Price tried to breathe, but it felt like he had no lungs. His hands twitched at his sides. He forced himself to glance up. Silas Cain's eyes met his, just for a heartbeat. There was no anger there, no triumph, no cruelty. Only silence. The kind of silence that told you that you had just stood in the presence of something you would never measure up to. Silas broke the gaze, turned, and walked on. Admiral Thompson turned his full attention back to Price, his expression carved from stone. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the weight of judgment. "Commander, you will remain here. When Mr. Cain is settled, my aide will escort you to the base legal office. You will surrender your command. You will be confined to quarters until further notice." Price's knees nearly buckled, his throat constricted. He opened his mouth, a plea forming, but the admiral's eyes froze him in place. "But that is not your punishment," Thompson continued, his voice colder now. "Your punishment will be to learn. You will spend the next year assigned to the Naval History and Heritage Command, archiving the stories of the men you so clearly fail to comprehend. You will read every report from Korea, from Vietnam, from men like him. You will learn their names, their sacrifices. You will learn the meaning of the uniform you wear." The admiral's words cut deeper than any demotion. Price lowered his head. For the first time in his career, rank meant nothing. Authority meant nothing. He felt like a boy again, stripped bare, lost in the shadow of something larger than he could ever hope to grasp. And in the silence that followed, he understood one thing with brutal clarity. He had not been chastised by a superior. He had been judged by history itself. Why did she feel her chest tighten, as if history itself had just brushed past her shoulder? Lieutenant Sarah Hale stood frozen near the end of the aisle, her basket hanging limp in her hand. She hadn't meant to stop. She hadn't meant to stare. She had only come for coffee, a quick errand before briefing. But when the commotion began, when Price's voice carried sharp and arrogant across the commissary, she had drifted closer, her eyes narrowing, her instinct to intervene gnawing at her chest. And then it happened. Ghost 5. The words detonated not just in the Admiral's chest, but in hers too, though she didn't even know why. She had never heard the name before, not formally. Yet the way it landed, the way the Admiral's face turned white, the way seasoned sailors straightened as if answering a muster from the grave, it pierced her. She watched the old man Silas Cain walk past, his step deliberate, his silence heavier than words. She felt her throat tighten, her skin prickle. She was a Navy pilot, trained, disciplined, forged in simulators and steel. But in that instant she felt young, painfully young, as though the ground beneath her boots belonged to someone else entirely. She followed him with her eyes as Master Chief Davies led him away. Not guiding, not commanding, but walking beside him like a squire beside a king. And in that silence, Sarah realized something she couldn't explain. She would never forget this moment. The Admiral's voice rose again behind her, sharp as judgment against Price. Sarah flinched, though the words weren't meant for her. She didn't stay to hear more. Instead, she drifted after the departing figures, her steps slow, deliberate, like a moth drawn into orbit around a flame she didn't yet understand. The commissary door slid open ahead. Silas stepped into the sunlight, his cap pulled low. The winter wind caught at his jacket, tugging the fabric against shoulders still straight despite the years. Sarah lingered at the entrance, watching as Davies led him across the courtyard toward the Admiral's office. She felt her breath fog in the cold, her chest constricting with an emotion she hadn't expected. Longing. Not for glory, not for medals. For meaning. She had flown missions. She had logged hours. She had served. But something about the way that old man carried silence made her realize how shallow her own definition of service still was. She turned back into the commissary, but the shelves, the shoppers, even the fluorescent lights felt different now. Thinner, dimmer. Price still stood rigid, face ashen, while the Admiral's aide fixed him with cold instruction. Sarah passed by him quietly, her eyes avoiding his. She felt no triumph in his shame, only pity. He, too, was a product of their time, ambition without depth, shine without weight. She left her basket behind. The coffee didn't matter anymore. Inside the Admiral's office, the air was warm, the faint hum of a heater filling the silence. Silas lowered himself into the chair Davies pulled out for him. The Master Chief set a steaming mug of coffee on the table before him, his own hands trembling as though afraid to set it down too forcefully. "Sir," Davies said softly, his voice thick, "it's an honor." Silas gave the faintest smile, lines crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "No need for that, Master Chief. Sit. You've done enough standing in your life." Davies hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair opposite, still unable to tear his eyes from the man before him. The Admiral stood near the window, his back to them, staring out at the flag snapping in the wind. His hands were clasped behind him, shoulders rigid, as though he were steadying himself before turning back. Silas sipped the coffee slowly, his hands steady now. The warmth seemed to ease something deep within him. "Sir," the Admiral said at last, turning. His voice was softer than before, stripped of ceremony. "I need to ask, why now? Why reveal yourself after all these years?" Silas set the cup down, his eyes drifting to the tabletop. For a long moment he said nothing. When he did, his voice was quiet, reflective. "I didn't reveal anything, Admiral. That boy pulled it out of me. I never meant for that name to be spoken again." The Admiral studied him, eyes narrowing. And yet it was. Do you understand what this means? The files say you died. The entire story of Ghost Team rests on the notion that no one survived. That legend has been told for decades. You are a living contradiction. Silas's gaze lifted, meeting his. The Admiral saw it then, the weight in his eyes. The kind of weight a man carried when every night for 50 years had been haunted by the same faces. Maybe that's all I am, Silas said softly. A contradiction. The room fell silent again, the truth heavier than the words. Sarah Hale sat 2 offices down, summoned for a routine briefing that now felt like anything but routine. Through the wall she couldn't hear words, only muffled tones, the Admiral's low voice, the deeper rumble of Silas Cain. She leaned back in her chair, restless. Her fingers tapped against her thigh. Why did it matter so much to her? She didn't know this man, didn't know the mission, but something in his presence lingered, pressing on her like a question she couldn't answer. Her mind slipped back to Price's arrogance, the way Silas had absorbed it without anger, only patience. And then the Admiral's reaction, the sudden collapse of all hierarchy, the way the entire base seemed to bow beneath 2 words, Ghost 5. She felt her pulse quicken. She thought of her own call sign, still new, given half in jest during her last training sortie. A name that meant little, carried no weight. Would it ever matter? Would it ever be whispered with reverence, or would it vanish as quickly as the echo of her jet fatting over the ocean? She swallowed, her throat dry. There was something about seeing living history walk past you that forced you to measure yourself. And she didn't like the answer. Inside the office, the Admiral finally spoke again. I read about you, Thompson admitted, his voice low. Not your name, that was sealed, but the story. At Annapolis, they told it to us in hushed tones. I thought it was myth, a parable, a reminder of what men could endure. I had no idea it was real, that you were real. Silas's lips curved faintly. Ghost stories have their place, Admiral. They inspire. Sometimes better that way, without a face, without the blood. Davies leaned forward, his voice hushed but urgent. But you did it. Alone. You carried the mission through. Sir, do you understand what that means to men like me, to generations who— Stop. The word was soft but final. Silas's gaze cut to him, sharp despite its calm. Don't put me on a pedestal, Master Chief. 4 men went in with me. 4 better men. Braver, stronger. They died on the first night. If you remember me and forget them, you've misunderstood everything. Davies' throat worked. He lowered his eyes. The Admiral crossed the room slowly, standing near the table, his hands braced on the edge as he leaned closer. Then tell us about them. Tell us what really happened. Silas's eyes darkened, flickering with shadows long buried. He looked down at the coffee cup, tracing the rim with his thumb. Some things, he murmured, are easier to carry in silence. Sarah sat straighter when the door opened. Davies stepped out, his expression unreadable, his eyes red-rimmed as though he had walked through memory itself. He saw Sarah waiting and paused. You heard, he asked. She shook her head, just enough to know I don't understand any of it. Davies studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. Maybe one day you will. And he walked on. Sarah turned her gaze toward the office door, her chest tight. Something told her that inside, stories were being unearthed that could shake the very ground she stood on. And she knew, somehow, that those stories were no longer just Silas Cain. They were hers too. Why did his silence weigh heavier than his words? Sarah Hale had been summoned into the Admiral's office not as a witness, not even as a pilot, but as a presence. The Admiral had glanced at her in the hallway, noted her posture, the quiet intensity in her eyes, and told her to step inside. She obeyed without question, though her chest tightened as she crossed the threshold. Silas Cain sat in a chair near the window, the late light falling across the lines of his face. His cap rested on the table now, its fabric frayed, its emblem dulled by time. He seemed smaller somehow without it, more fragile, yet the room still bent toward him, as though gravity itself acknowledged his weight. The Admiral stood near the desk, his hands behind his back, while Master Chief Davies lingered in the corner like a silent sentinel. And Sarah, she sat opposite Silas, unsure why she had been placed there, feeling almost intrusive, yet unable to tear her eyes away. The Admiral broke the silence. "Mr. Cain, I understand if some details must remain sealed, but if you're willing, tell us. Tell us about Ghost Team, about Operation Nightfall." Silas didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the rim of the coffee cup before him, the motion slow, deliberate. His gaze lifted to the window, as though the snow-swept courtyard outside carried him back through decades. Finally he spoke. "It was winter, cold like you can't imagine. Germany fatting behind us, the Iron Curtain ahead. We jumped at night, 5 of us, Ghost Team." His voice was low, steady, carrying a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Sarah leaned forward unconsciously, her breath caught. "There was Maddox," Silas continued. "Big man, strong enough to carry 2 packs when one of us faltered. But it wasn't his strength that mattered most, it was his laugh, loud enough to shake frost off the trees. He kept us warm just by being near. He had a wife waiting back in Kansas. A boy not yet 2. He carried their picture tucked inside his vest, pulled it out every time the world went quiet." Silas paused, his eyes clouding. "He died first." The room went still. Sarah felt her stomach clench, though she had never known Maddox, never seen his face. She could see him now, drawn by Silas's voice. A giant of a man, cut down in silence behind the lines. "Then there was Ruiz," Silas said softly. "Youngest of us, barely 22, but he was fire. Could run faster, shoot straighter, climb higher than any of us. He called me old man even then. Said I walked like I carried ghosts. Maybe he was right." Silas's lips curved faintly, but the shadow never left his eyes. He didn't make it past the second night. Sarah felt her pulse thrum. She thought of her own squadron, the men and women she flew with, faces still whole, laughter still alive. The thought of losing even one of them twisted her chest. To lose 4 in silence with no one to witness, her throat tightened. Silas shifted, his voice deepening. "And Jensen, he was the quiet one, good with maps, better with silence. If Maddox was the laugh, Jensen was the whisper, always steady, always precise. He could calm us just by breathing. He's the one who spotted the Spetsnaz closing in that first night. Gave us 10 extra seconds to fire back. 10 seconds that bought me 50 years." Silas swallowed, his hand tightening slightly around the cup. He took a round through the chest, never made a sound. Sarah's eyes burned. She blinked quickly, hiding the moisture before it could betray her. "And the last," Silas said, his voice softening almost to a whisper. "Keller, he was my partner. We trained together for 2 years before nightfall. I trusted him more than anyone. He could read my mind in the field. He was the kind of man who never hesitated, not once. On the 3rd night when the ambush came, he pulled me out of the line of fire. Took the hit meant for me. When I tried to drag him, he told me to go. He smiled when he said it." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sarah sat stiff, her throat raw. She had never heard names spoken like this. In her training and her briefings, fallen comrades were numbers, units, tallies. Here they were men, vivid, alive, tethered forever to one man's voice. Silas's gaze lowered, his shoulders sagged. "I walked alone after that. 4 days in and Ghost Team was gone, just me." The Admiral exhaled sharply, the sound almost like a prayer. Sarah leaned forward, unable to stop herself. "Sir, how did you keep going, alone?" Silas's eyes lifted to hers. For the first time his gaze locked fully on her, steady and unflinching. "How does anyone?" he asked quietly. "You put one foot in front of the other. You tell yourself you'll stop after the next ridge, after the next night. And then somehow you wake up and 23 days have passed." His eyes softened, almost pitying. "You don't think about courage. You think about breath, about hunger, about keeping your rifle dry in the snow, and sometimes about the faces of men you couldn't save. Sarah swallowed hard. She felt a flush of shame at her earlier question. She had expected something larger, some grand answer, but what he gave her was small, human, terrible in its simplicity. The Admiral spoke again, his voice careful. And the mission, the target. Silas nodded slowly. I reached it. Soviet facility tucked deep into the mountains. They thought they were untouchable, but untouchable men forget to look over their shoulders. Sarah's breath caught. The weight of his words felt heavier than classified files, heavier than all the acronyms and codes she had studied. What did you do? She whispered. Silas's gaze darkened. What I had to. I planted the charges. I watched the fire rise into the night. And then I ran with no map, no friend, no plan. Just ran south, step by step, until I saw the Turkish border. He fell silent then, the memory closing like a door. The Admiral's eyes glistened. Davies shifted, blinking hard. Sarah sat rigid, her chest tight, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time since she had earned her wings, she felt small. Not in defeat, but in recognition. Recognition that the uniform she wore, the flag she saluted, had been carried forward not just by victories in clean battles, but by men walking alone in frozen darkness with nothing but silence for company. She looked at Silas Cain and realized she was staring not at a myth, not even at a hero, but at a man who had borne the unbearable and then chosen never to speak of it again. And in that realization, a question formed in her heart, unbidden, frightening. Would she have had the strength? She didn't know. And that not knowing haunted her more than any answer. Outside, the flag snapped in the wind. Inside, the silence stretched. Silas reached for his cap, brushing the brim with his fingertips. His voice, when it came again, was softer than before. They tell stories about Ghost 5, he murmured, but the truth is simple. Ghost 5 was 5 men, only one walked out. Don't ever forget the other 4. Sarah lowered her gaze, her throat burning. She whispered almost to herself, I won't. Silas looked at her then, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes softened, recognition, perhaps, of the weight she had just taken on. And in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Sometimes the heaviest inheritance isn't medals, or stories, or even orders. It's silence. How long can one man live as prey before he becomes something else entirely? Sarah Hale asked herself that question as she sat across from Silas Cain, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She tried not to move, not to breathe too loudly, afraid that even the smallest sound might break the fragile rhythm of his story. His words had a cadence, slow and deliberate, each syllable carrying decades of silence finally cracking open. And when he spoke again, his voice carried her to a place she had never imagined. The snow was my enemy, and my friend, Silas said, his eyes unfocused, staring past her, past the Admiral, into memory itself. Every step left a mark. Every breath fogged the air. If I moved, they could follow me. If I stopped, the cold would eat me alive. You learn to choose your enemy. Sarah's throat tightened. She tried to picture it, tried to imagine being alone in a land where every tree, every shadow might carry a hunter's rifle. Her training simulators had been loud, mechanical. This was the opposite. Silence. Endless silence. They sent dogs after me, Silas continued, his voice low. You can hear them before you see them, barking. Then the shots, sharp and angry. I remember lying in a ditch, holding my breath, the snow piled over me like a blanket. I could feel their footsteps above me, close enough to shake the ground. One of the dogs caught my scent, came right up to where I was buried. Sarah felt her pulse race. Silas's lips pressed together, his jaw tightening. I reached out with my hand, slow, careful, and let it find my fingers. It growled, teeth close to my skin. I thought it would give me away, but it didn't bark. It just stared at me. Then it turned, padded off into the dark. For a second I thought maybe even an animal knew what I was. Not prey, not predator, just a ghost. Sarah exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. Master Chief Davies shifted in his chair, his knuckles whitening where they gripped his knees. The Admiral's face was rigid, but his eyes glistened. Food was harder than enemies, Silas went on. I found berries, roots, sometimes a rabbit if I was lucky, but it wasn't enough. Hunger changes you, makes you slower, makes you doubt. On the 12th day I thought about stopping, just lying down in the snow, letting it take me. Easier than walking, easier than remembering the 4 men I'd left behind. His voice cracked just slightly on those words. Sarah's chest clenched. She wanted to say something, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the weight in the room told her to stay silent. Some burdens were too sacred for interruption. I dreamed about them, Silas whispered. Maddox laughing, Ruiz sprinting ahead, Jensen with his maps, Keller pulling me out of the fire. Every night they came back. Sometimes I thought they were leading me. Other times I thought they were waiting on the other side. The silence stretched, heavy, unbearable. Sarah's own memories pressed against her, the first time she had sat in a cockpit, trembling, doubting herself, certain she wasn't strong enough. It seemed so small now, so insignificant, and yet it was the same question Silas had faced. Do you stop or do you go on? She looked at him, at the way his fingers rested against the cap on the table, and realized she had never met a man so calm in describing something so close to death. The Admiral cleared his throat, his voice low. And the Soviets, the hunters. Silas's gaze sharpened. Always there, always close. I'd see their fires at night, hear their laughter echo across the trees. Sometimes I'd double back, walk in circles, lead them away. Sometimes I'd leave traps not to kill, just to delay. Every hour I bought was another hour to move. His eyes narrowed slightly. But I wasn't just running, I still had a mission. Sarah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. I found the facility on the 18th day, Silas said. Hidden in the mountains, guarded, quiet. I watched from a ridge, counted their routines, memorized every step. They were sure no one could reach them. That arrogance saved me. He paused, his voice lowering. I slipped inside at night. My pack was almost empty, but I had enough left, charges, timers. My hands shook from the cold, but I set them anyway. When the fire rose, I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just walked away, because fire doesn't care who it warms or who it burns. Sarah shivered. She could see it, the blaze cutting across the snow, the old man's younger body walking alone into the dark, carrying nothing but silence. The last 5 days were worse, Silas admitted, his voice tightening. No food left, boots frozen stiff. I wrapped my feet in rags when the leather split, every step bled. But the horizon became everything. I told myself 1 more mile, 1 more ridge, just 1 more. He fell silent again, his eyes distant. Sarah pressed her lips together, afraid to break the moment. She thought of her own call sign, the one her squadron had given her. It had always been a joke, a light-hearted nickname passed around in briefings. But here now, listening to him, she felt the word call sign grow heavy, sacred. It wasn't just a name. It was a story, a burden, a testament. When Silas finally spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. On the 23rd day, I saw the border, Turkish soldiers. I thought I was dreaming. I collapsed 10 feet from them, woke up in a field hospital 2 days later. They told me I'd made it, but the men I'd left behind didn't. So you tell me, did I? His voice faded into silence, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Sarah felt her eyes sting, her throat closing. She wanted to answer him, to tell him that survival was enough, that what he had done mattered. But no words came, only a quiet ache in her chest. The Admiral bowed his head, his voice thick. Mr. Cain, what you carried was more than any man should, and yet you carried it. Silas didn't respond. He only picked up his cap again, brushing the brim with his thumb. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. She had come into the room as a pilot, a lieutenant, a woman chasing flight hours and commendations. But listening to him, she felt stripped bare. Every mission she had flown, every hour she had logged, suddenly felt like preparation for a weight she hadn't yet been asked to carry. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she could. The silence stretched long. Finally, Silas looked at her. His eyes were tired but sharp, piercing. "What's your name, Lieutenant?" She straightened, surprised by the question. "Hale, sir, Sarah Hale." "Your call sign." Her lips parted. She hesitated, embarrassed suddenly by the joke of it. "They call me Sparrow." Silas studied her for a moment. The corner of his mouth lifted, not in mockery but in something else. "Sparrow," he murmured. "Small bird, flies farther than it looks like it should. Don't lose that." Sarah blinked, her chest tightening. No one had ever spoken her call sign like that before, as if it carried weight, meaning, destiny. And in that moment, something shifted in her. Maybe strength wasn't measured in medals, or in hours logged, or in how loud your name carried in the halls. Maybe it was measured in silence, in the steps you took when no one was watching. Outside, the sky was dimming, the winter sun fading. Inside, the room felt smaller now, crowded not by people but by the ghosts of 4 men who had never returned. Silas Cain sat quietly, sipping his coffee, his story unfinished but enough. Sarah Hale sat across from him, her heart pounding, her doubts louder than before, but also her resolve. Because some stories don't crush you. They forge you. Why did surviving feel harder than dying? Sarah Hale sat across from Silas Cain, her hands folded tightly together, as if holding herself still would help her absorb every word. He had carried her into the snowfields of 1968, into fire and hunger, into the kind of silence that burned. And now, as his voice softened, she realized he was about to tell the part no one ever speaks of, the part after survival. He took off his cap, set it carefully on the table, and stared at it for a long moment before he spoke again. "They told me I'd done something great," Silas murmured. "Medics, officers, even the brass that came to debrief me. They told me I was a hero. I didn't feel like one. I felt like a thief. 4 men went in. 1 came out. What's heroic about that?" Sarah's chest tightened. She knew the answer she wanted to give, the answer drilled into them all in classrooms and speeches. You carried the mission. You carried their sacrifice forward. But hearing him, seeing his eyes, she knew the words would sound hollow. Silas leaned back slightly, his voice low, reflective. "I didn't tell them everything. Not about how close I came to quitting. Not about the nights I wanted to die. I gave them enough for their reports, enough for their history books. And then I signed the papers and walked away. They said the mission never happened, said my name would never be spoken. They stamped it classified and closed the file." He tapped the cap with one finger, his hand trembling slightly. "Do you know what it's like to be told you don't exist? To be told your brothers never existed?" Sarah swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. "No, sir." Silas nodded faintly. "It eats at you every day. You walk through grocery stores, you sit on park benches, people pass you by smiling, laughing, not knowing. You want to scream, but you don't. You just stop talking, stop trying to explain. Eventually, silence becomes your home." Davies shifted in his chair, blinking quickly, his broad shoulders tight. The Admiral, usually iron and stone, looked down at the floor, his lips pressed thin. Silas's eyes lifted again, steady but lined with grief. "I buried them myself in silence. Maddox, Ruiz, Jensen, Keller. Their names lived only in me. No medals, no funerals, no folded flags. Their families never even knew the truth. And every year that passed, I wondered if I dishonored them more by living than by dying with them." Sarah's throat ached. She thought of the men and women in her squadron laughing in the ready room, scribbling notes on briefing papers, joking about call signs. What if tomorrow they were gone and she alone walked away? Would she carry their names as heavily as he had? Would silence consume her too? Her voice came out before she could stop it. How did you keep going? Silas looked at her, the faintest crease forming in his brow, as though surprised by the question. I didn't always, he admitted. There were years I drank too much, years I kept to myself, years I let the silence swallow everything around me. People thought I was shy, thought I was tired. They didn't know I was haunted. You don't get rid of ghosts, Lieutenant. You just learn to sit with them. The word ghosts hung heavy in the air. Sarah shivered, remembering his call sign Ghost 5. How cruelly fitting it seemed now, not a mark of legend but a sentence he had carried all his life. The Admiral's voice broke the silence, low and respectful. And yet you endured. You built a life, you stayed. Silas gave the faintest shake of his head. Endurance isn't always noble, Admiral. Sometimes it's just stubbornness. Some mornings I'd wake up and say, fine, I'll live one more day. Then I'd say it again the next morning. 50 years later, here we are. Sarah drew in a shaky breath. She couldn't imagine carrying 50 years like that, carrying silence so heavy it bent a man's shoulders even when he sat straight. And yet she envied it too. Envied the strength hidden in that survival, even if it was broken and weary. She shifted in her seat, her voice tentative. Sir, do you ever regret it? Coming home, I mean. The room went still. Even the heater's hum seemed to fade. Silas's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Every day, he said quietly, and never all at once. I regret not dying with them. I regret not giving them the chance to come home in my place. But I don't regret seeing the sky again. Don't regret feeling the sun on my face. Don't regret meeting the men who came after and knowing the world still spun. It's both, Lieutenant, always both. Sarah lowered her gaze, her chest tightening until it hurt. She thought of her own doubts, the nights she had wondered if she was good enough, if she deserved the wings she wore. Compared to his burden, her insecurities seemed selfish. Yet hearing him admit regret, raw, unpolished, gave her something unexpected. Permission. Permission to feel doubt, to stumble, to be human. Silas reached for his cap again, his thumb brushing the frayed emblem. They called me Ghost 5 because I came back when I shouldn't have, he murmured. But I've always wondered if the real ghost was the man who walked out of those woods, because Silas Cain died in that snow. What came out wasn't the same. Sarah's breath caught. She saw it in his eyes, the fracture, the break, the endless weight of survival, and yet beneath it a strength so fierce it scared her. She realized then that the Admiral's awe, Davy's reverence, all of it wasn't about legend. It was about endurance, about a man who had carried silence longer than anyone should and still walked into a commissary 50 years later and stood calm under ridicule. The Admiral stepped closer, his voice rough with emotion. Mr. Cain, I can't undo the silence they forced on you, but I can tell you this. Today you spoke their names, and as long as I command this base, they will not be forgotten again. Silas looked up at him, eyes unreadable. For a moment, Sarah thought he might argue, might retreat back into silence, but instead he nodded faintly. That's all I ever wanted, he said softly. The room grew quiet again, the weight of his words settling like dust after a storm. Sarah sat still, but inside she felt a shift, a deep stirring she couldn't yet name. For years she had measured herself against speed, precision, checklists, the clean lines of flying. But now, listening to Silas Cain, she realized none of that mattered if she didn't have the strength to carry silence, to carry ghosts. And for the first time in her career, she wondered, not if she could fly, but if she could endure. Later, when the meeting adjourned, Sarah lingered at the edge of the office while Davies helped Silas to his feet. The old man moved slowly, but with dignity, adjusting his cap as if to armor himself again. As he passed her, Silas paused. His eyes met hers, steady, piercing. You asked how I kept going, he said quietly. Don't look for an answer in me, find it in yourself. One day you'll need it. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her lips parting with words she couldn't form. By the time she blinked, he was already moving past, Davies beside him, leaving her with a silence heavier than any briefing, heavier than any mission. The Admiral turned to her, his voice low. "Lieutenant Hale, I didn't summon you here by chance. You're young, but you needed to hear this. We all did. Take it with you. Carry it." She nodded, her throat tight. "Aye, sir." And as she stepped out of the office, the winter air biting her cheeks, she realized she had been given something more than a story. She had been given a ghost. And now, whether she wanted it or not, it would follow her into the cockpit, into every mission, into every moment she chose to keep moving when stopping seemed easier. Sometimes survival isn't a victory. Sometimes survival is the quietest form of courage. And Sarah Hale knew she had just witnessed it, in the silence of an old man who had carried 50 years alone. Why did her cockpit feel heavier than it ever had before? The canopy sealed shut with a hiss, and suddenly Lieutenant Sarah Hale was alone in a world of dials, screens, and endless sky. The airbase lay behind her, a frozen line of concrete and hangars glinting in the winter sun. Ahead was the horizon, wide, open, waiting. She had flown countless sorties, training missions, patrol flights, endless hours in the simulator. Yet as the jet's engines roared to life, as her call sign flickered in her headset, Sparrow, something felt different. Silas Cain's voice lived in her chest. "You don't think about courage, you think about breath." Her hands gripped the throttle tighter than usual. Her heart beat faster, not from adrenaline but from the echo of his silence. For the first time, she realized she wasn't chasing precision or speed or perfection. She was chasing something harder, the ability to keep moving when every instinct told you to stop. Tower Sparrow 1 cleared for takeoff. Her wingman's voice crackled. She forced her own reply, steady, professional. Tower Sparrow 2 cleared. The jet surged forward, the runway streaking beneath her. She pulled back, felt the wheels lift, and the sky opened. But today the sky wasn't freedom, it was burden. The mission was simple on paper. A low-visibility reconnaissance exercise along the coast simulated enemy radar sweeping the area. A test of navigation, silence, and endurance. No live fire, no glory. Just long hours, low fuel margins, and the constant weight of being unseen. It should have been routine. But for Sarah Hale, routine no longer existed. The clouds pressed low and gray, swallowing the horizon. Her HUD flickered with readings, but her mind wasn't on the screens. It was on Silas Cain, walking alone through snowfields, hunted, starving, moving one step at a time. Her wingman's voice cut through the static. "Sparrow 2, adjust heading 315. Radar sweep at your 10 o'clock. "Acknowledged," she replied automatically, but her chest was tight, her breath shallow. One more mile, one more ridge, just one more. The words pulsed in her mind, not hers but his, as if she had inherited his ghosts. For 2 hours they flew through silence. No chatter, no distractions, only the hum of engines and the hiss of oxygen in her mask. Every minute, Sarah felt the weight pressing heavier. Flying had always been movement, exhilaration. Now it felt like endurance. And then it happened. Her HUD flickered, a warning light blinked, fuel imbalance, nothing catastrophic but enough to complicate things. She tapped the gauge, checked the system. Her wingman's voice cut in. "Sparrow 2, you seeing that?" "Yeah," she muttered. "Left tank's feeding slow. I can compensate." "Tower will want you back early." Sarah hesitated, her hand tightening on the throttle. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to play it safe, to let the problem end the mission. It was the logical choice, the professional choice. But then she saw him again, Silas, hunched in the snow, boots splitting, bleeding feet wrapped in rags. No support, no exfil, and still walking. Her jaw clenched, negative continuing. Her wingman's pause was heavy. "Your call, Sparrow." It was, and for the first time she understood what that meant. The clouds thickened, pressing down, visibility dropping. She adjusted trim, steadying her jet against turbulence. Her body ached, her eyes strained against the gray. She thought of Silas, 23 days with no food, no rest, hunted every step. How long can one person endure? Her wingman's voice crackled again. Radar sweep closing. We'll have to cut low over the water. Sarah's pulse quickened. Low flight in bad weather meant danger, disorientation, less margin for error. She had trained for it, but now, with her fuel issue gnawing at her, the risk felt heavier. Her breath fogged her mask. She whispered to herself, words she didn't even mean to say aloud. One more mile, just one more. And suddenly she wasn't in her cockpit. She was in the snow, walking with him, carrying silence and ghosts, moving forward not because she wanted to, but because stopping wasn't an option. She dropped altitude, the sea churning gray beneath her. Waves rose like claws, lightning flickered faint in the distance. Her instruments screamed adjustments, but her hands were steady. Her wingman's voice broke the silence. "You good, Sparrow?" She almost said no, but then she remembered Silas's words. "You don't think about courage, you think about breath." "I'm good," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. And she was, somehow. Hours later, when the exercise finally ended, when the jets landed one by one, Sarah taxied back to the hangar with trembling hands. Her fuel gauges were low, her body ached, her nerves burned raw. But she had finished. She had not turned back. As she climbed down the ladder, her wingman clapped her on the shoulder. Could have called it quits. No shame in that. Sarah managed a small, tired smile. Sometimes shame isn't the point. He looked at her strangely, but she didn't explain. How could she? Inside, she felt something new. Not pride, not triumph, something quieter, something heavier. Endurance. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat alone in her quarters, the silence pressing in. Normally she hated silence, filled it with music or chatter or noise. But now she sat with it, letting it stretch. She thought of Silas Cain, of Maddox, Ruiz, Jensen, Keller, names she had never known until that day, now etched into her memory as if she had served beside them. She whispered them aloud softly in the dark. Maddox, Ruiz, Jensen, Keller. Her chest ached, but it felt right to speak them, to carry them even if she had never met them. And she realized this was how legacies worked, not through medals or monuments, through names spoken in silence, carried forward by those who listened. She lay down, eyes closing. The weight of ghosts pressed on her, but not as a curse, as a guide. And for the first time, she felt ready. Not for glory, not for applause. For endurance. Sometimes missions aren't won by speed, or firepower or precision. Sometimes they're won by refusing to stop. And Sarah Hale understood now that this was what Silas Cain had given her. Not a story, but a way to walk into the dark and keep moving. Why do legends always disappear as quietly as they arrive? The base seemed different in the days that followed, as if the winter air itself had thickened. Sailors walked with straighter backs. Conversations hushed when Silas Cain's name, or rather his call sign, was whispered. Ghost 5 had walked among them. Not a story, not a myth, a man. But to Sarah Hale, the weight was more personal. She carried him into the cockpit, into her steps, into the silence of her own thoughts. She had not spoken to him again after that meeting, though she wanted to. Wanted to ask questions, wanted to thank him. But each time she saw him at a distance, walking slow across the courtyard with Master Chief Davies at his side, she held back. Something told her not to intrude. Some men deserved to walk in silence, and all you could do was keep step from afar. And then, one morning, he was gone. No ceremony, no announcement. The guest room where he had been staying stood empty. The chair in the Admiral's office where he had sipped coffee was bare. Only his cap remained, folded neatly, left on the desk like an echo. Sarah stood in the doorway when she learned. She stared at the cap, the threads worn, the brim bent. "Where did he go?" she asked, her voice low. The Admiral stood behind his desk, his expression solemn. He didn't say, he only asked not to be followed. Davy's voice was rough, unsteady. "Man like that doesn't need escorts." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the cap. "So he just left?" The Admiral nodded slowly. "That's what ghosts do, Lieutenant." The words sank into her chest, cold and final. She wanted to argue, wanted to chase him, but something in her knew the Admiral was right. Silas Cain had carried 50 years of silence. He had given them one glimpse, one moment, and then he had returned to where he belonged, the shadows of memory. But even in absence, he wasn't gone. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the hangar. Her jet loomed above her, wings glinting in the dull light. The hangar was empty, quiet, except for the faint drip of melting ice. She climbed the ladder, settled into the cockpit, and closed her eyes. She whispered their names again, the ones Silas had given life to. Maddox, Ruiz, Jensen, Keller. Each name felt heavier than any briefing, heavier than any checklist. She whispered his too. Silas Cain, Ghost 5. And then her own, Sparrow. The word no longer felt small. She understood now what a call sign meant. It wasn't a nickname. It was a story you carried, even if no one else ever knew the weight behind it. A reminder that when the time came, when silence pressed in, you had to endure. She opened her eyes, staring at the controls, the endless black of the canopy glass. Her career would go on. Missions would rise and fall. Friends would come and go. But always she would remember that old man's silence and the lesson he had left without preaching. Endurance is not loud. It is not celebrated. It simply continues. Weeks passed. Sarah flew again, trained again, lived again. But something had changed in her squadron. She found herself listening more than she spoke. She caught herself studying the faces of her wingmen, memorizing their laughter, their small habits, the way Ruiz had once existed only in Silas's memory. She carried a notebook now, tucked into her flight bag, not for technical notes but for names. Every time someone impressed her or taught her or made her laugh, she wrote their name down. She told no one. It wasn't official. It wasn't regulation. But she was determined that no one she flew beside would be forgotten, even if silence came for her one day too. Her wingman noticed the difference. "You've been quiet lately, Sparrow, different." Sarah only smiled faintly, learning to listen. One evening, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, she found herself walking the perimeter of the base. The air was sharp, the stars faint in the haze. She stopped at the flagpole, staring up at the fabric snapping against the dark. She thought of Silas Cain, alone in the snow, hunted, starved, still walking. She thought of his silence afterward, the 50 years of carrying ghosts no one else would carry. And she thought of the day he left, vanishing as quietly as he had come. She whispered again, this time to the flag, to the wind, to herself. "Don't ever forget the other 4." Her breath fogged in the air, then faded. But the words remained. In the Admiral's office, the cap stayed on the shelf. Visitors sometimes asked about it, sometimes not. Thompson never explained. Neither did Davies. But every now and then, a young sailor would glance at it, curiosity flickering. And Sarah would catch their gaze, give the faintest shake of her head. Not a denial, not secrecy, just reverence. Some stories were not told in full. Some stories were carried. Months later, Sarah found herself in the sky again, the jet trembling under her hands as turbulence rocked it. Her oxygen mask pressed tight against her face, her heart hammering. She whispered to herself, calm, steady, "One more mile, just one more." And she flew on. Silas Cain was never seen again on that base. Some said he returned to the small town where no one knew his name. Others believed he slipped into the quiet, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to draw notice. Perhaps he walked back into the snow one final time. But for Sarah Hale, and for those who had stood in that commissary on the day the Admiral's face turned white, he had never left. Because some men do not vanish when they disappear. They linger in silence. They linger in the names spoken aloud. They linger in the endurance of those who keep moving. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And sometimes the ghosts we carry are not there to haunt us. They are there to keep us walking,